Hello, everybody. As from the communications team of the Society of Pediatric Pain Medicine, I am Genevieve D'Souza, Associate Clinical Professor at Stanford University, Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative and Pain Medicine. And I'm here with Dr. Gregory Hammer, who is a professor in the Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative Pain Medicine, and also in the Department of Pediatrics and Intensive Care. And we are here today to talk about Oliceridine, which is a next generation IV opioid. So Dr. Hammer, welcome. And let's start with, give us a quick overview of why this is so exciting.
Sure, well, it's great to be with you, Genevieve.
Thank you.
As you suggested, Oliceridine might be considered a next generation IV opioid because it is what's called a G protein coupled receptor ligand. That is, when it binds with the opioid receptor, it is selective in that it activates the G protein pathway, but has minimal activation of the beta-arrestin pathway. That is important because the G protein pathway is that which modulates analgesia. The beta-arrestin pathway, which is minimally activated by Oliceridine, is the pathway that causes many of the side effects of opioids, such as respiratory depression, constipation, nausea, vomiting, and pruritus. So I think this is really the future of compounds for pain in that, we have these molecules that are in development that are selective. We used to think that when an opioid bound to the opioid receptor, that it turned the receptor on, or it was either an on or an off configuration. And so when a morphine binds the mu-opioid receptor, it turns it on or activates it. But actually things are a little bit more nuanced than that. And as with other receptors, there may be more than one pathway inside the cell that is activated when the agonist binds its receptor.
Wonderful. And I understand you were involved with the studies on the adult population. So can you tell us some of the key findings during the adult studies?
Sure. Well, I think, one of the most impressive findings is actually a phase 1 study in which I was not involved, where human volunteers went into the respiratory lab and were given either morphine or an equianalgesic dose of Oliceridine. Initially, the equianalgesic dose of Oliceridine was determined by the cold pressor test, in which various doses of Oliceridine were given until the results of the cold pressor test were comparable to that achieved by a given dose of morphine. And then in the next phase, a CO2 challenge was given to the volunteers who received either morphine or Oliceridine. And the ventilatory response to CO2 was measured. And impressively, I think, the Oliceridine patients or subjects had significantly less depression or suppression of the CO2-induced ventilatory response. So normally, of course, when we're given CO2 to inspire, it will cause us to have an increase in our minute ventilation, which is a sort of a homeostatic process. And that really is the gold standard measurement for respiratory depression. And so the fact that Oliceridine provided analgesia, but significantly less depression of ventilatory response to CO2 in this phase 1 study was, I think, quite impressive. Respiratory depression is hard to measure in phase 3 and 4 studies in clinical trials. But there were subsequently phase 3 studies with Oliceridine, which were the Apollo studies. There were 2 studies in Apollo. One was after bunionectomy and one was after abdominoplasty. And in both of those phase 3 studies, the analgesic efficacy of Oliceridine was confirmed. and it was found to be safe and also, as I said, effective. There was a subsequent phase 3 study done in all comers, that is sort of in a real world model where patients undergoing a wide variety of surgeries were included. That was the Athena study. And in that study as well, excuse me, the efficacy of Oliceridine was confirmed, and there was a reduction in nausea, vomiting compared to historic studies of morphine. Unfortunately, the respiratory endpoint, which was something that the company devised as in an attempt to put together respiratory events and their duration, this sort of respiratory depression index, that endpoint was not met. But I think that it's important to consider that in clinical studies, like phase 3 studies, it's very hard to measure respiratory depression. We really only have surrogate measures, including oxygen desaturation or decrease in respiratory rate below a certain number, or perhaps episodes that require intervention with positive pressure or repositioning the airway. So these are surrogate measures. They're very coarse endpoints. They don't really tell us very accurately whether or not there's respiratory depression. We can't really measure CO2 response to ventilation in patients after surgery. So I personally think that the phase 1 study for respiratory depression is sufficient to achieve a label that Oliceridine causes less respiratory depression than other opioids, but the FDA did not agree with that. So while Oliceridine has been approved for use in adults who have or are expected to have moderate to severe pain in the hospital, the label will not include any language regarding respiratory depression.
And as you're getting geared up to start the study at a pediatric hospital like ours, can you tell us some of the advantages and challenges to starting any pediatric study?
Well, as you know, pediatric analgesia trials are notoriously difficult. Certainly in pre-verbal children, infants and children, we don't really distinguish very well between agitation related to hunger or being in a foreign environment, not being held by parents, and other factors really from pain. So in pre-verbal patients, analgesia trials are challenging. And even in verbal patients, analgesia trials can be challenging because of behavioral elements being confused with pain. So I am working with the company Trevena in planning the PREA trials, that is the Pediatric Research and Equity Act, which compels companies who bring a new product to market that will be used in children to do pediatric studies. So we're negotiating those studies with the FDA right now. It looks like the primary efficacy study will be based on regular dosing of Oliceridine versus placebo, and the children will have a PCA or nurse-activated analgesia pump. And so they'll have continuous access to opioid analgesia with, for example, hydromorphone. And then in addition to that, we'll be receiving either placebo or Oliceridine around the clock. And the primary endpoint will be the amount of PCA opioid that's required after surgery, expected to produce moderate to severe pain. And then in addition, there'll be pharmacokinetic studies. So again, you know, these studies in children are challenging. Parents are understandably somewhat reluctant to have their child participate in a study, especially if it involves a placebo. But, you know, these are the challenges that we have doing pediatric trials.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to interview with us today. And if you have any lasting words for the young researchers in our groups.
Well, I would just encourage young researchers to participate in clinical trials, including industry-sponsored trials, because this is really how we're going to get funding for important trials so that our pediatric patients are not drug orphans. We do want to facilitate FDA approval for medications that we're using, and so participation in these trials is important. The trials involve doing things a little bit differently than we might normally do, but as long as we feel that we're acting in the child's interest, I'm hoping that many of us are willing to work with our colleagues in surgery and in the intensive care unit, for example, in the pediatric medical services, to agree to have their patients enrolled in these trials. This is how we move the ball forward. You know, funding for from the NIH, for example, has been made increasingly difficult, and so I'm hoping that many junior researchers will get on board with industry-sponsored trials, as long as they feel they're completely ethical, of course. And there is some academic potential. You know, it's generally true that high enrollers are offered authorship on subsequent manuscripts that are produced, both abstracts and full-length papers. And I think it's rewarding to see the things moving forward in children in these clinical trials. So I hope that people won't abstain from industry-sponsored trials going forward.
Thank you for these words of wisdom. And once again, this is Dr. Gregory Hammer. I'm Genevieve D'Souza, and we are speaking on behalf of the Society for Pediatric Pain Medicine. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve.
Thank you.